Hello, my name is Gyöngyi Laurent, and I'm a professor of finance at the University of Vienna. And I would like to talk about what can be achieved with centralized supervision when we move from national to centralized supervision. You probably heard the presentation from Thorsten Beck. He was talking about the factors that make it more or less likely for countries to cooperate in their supervision. What I'm trying to do now is I look at the outcome of moving from national to supranational supervision. So why is this an interesting question? So after the financial crisis, we see a general trend toward more centralization, tighter cooperation in supervision. So the legitimate question is how this new supervisory architecture might affect national supervisors' incentive to collect information, how intervention rules change when we move from national to supranational supervision, how this affects banks' risk-taking incentives. Does this have any impact on the organizational choice of banks when they go abroad? And ultimately, how this change in supervision might affect financial integration. So probably you are aware of the fact that banks have various ways to go abroad. By and large, there are two representation forms used by cross-border banks when they go abroad. One is called branch and the other is called subsidiary. If you look at large cross-border banks, they actually exhibit quite a bit of heterogeneity in their use of branches versus subsidiaries. So the interesting question is, do they react to supranational supervision by changing their organizational structure? Does supranational supervision affect the bank incentive to go abroad? And we also would like to understand what these changes means in terms of the cost of insuring depositors. So let me spend the next slides a little bit telling you about what is the difference between branches and subsidiaries in terms of liability structure and in terms of supervisory structure. So let's start with the branch, which is an easier structure to remember. So when a bank goes abroad via using the branch shares liabilities and has the same balance sheet as the home unit. Both the branch as well as the home unit fall under the supervisory attention of the home supervisor. So home supervisor provides monitoring, supervision, and also in charge of insuring depositors in the foreign country. When we move to the subsidiary, the picture is actually more complicated. Why it is more complicated? So first of all, because here we have two supervisors. So the home unit is supervised by the home supervisor, and the foreign unit is supervised by the host supervisor. So both of them are responsible for deposit insurance for the local unit. So this is from the supervisory point of view, the difference between a subsidiary and a branch. But there is also an important difference in terms of liability structure, in that you can think about the subsidiary as the asset of the home unit. Actually, it's a levered asset of the home unit because foreign depositors have priority seniority on the assets of the subsidiary. So what does this actually mean? So what it means is that, for example, when the home unit faces difficulties and the home supervisor steps in, then the home supervisor has sort of an equity claim on the assets of the subsidiary. So why this is important? Why this is important? Because here now we have two supervisors who are supervising the local unit, and there might be externalities when one supervisor taking decisions on the cost of the other supervisor residing in the other country. So what are these costs we can think about? What are the externalities we can think about? So there are actually two possible externalities we can think about, which goes from the foreign supervisor to the home supervisor. There is no reverse externality going on. Why? Because the home unit is not responsible for the losses of the subsidiary. So any decision made by the home supervisor on the home unit is not going to affect, at least not, there will be no first order effect on the cost of the foreign supervisor of the foreign unit. So what are the externalities? So one externality is that when the foreign supervisor intervenes with the aim of reducing deposit insurance costs for depositors of the foreign unit, then this is going to reduce the value of the equity of the subsidiary. Now, what does it mean? Well, if the value of the equity in the subsidiary is reduced, this means that this ultimately increases or might increase the deposit insurance cost, which the home supervisor has to cover when the home unit fails, and therefore the home supervisor has to step in order to reimburse depositors. This is one thing. This is what we call intervention effect. So when the foreign supervisor decides whether to intervene or not, it's not going to take into consideration the externality it produces on the cost of the home supervisor. The other externality is something which we call monitoring externality. So what monitoring does in this framework, monitoring allows a supervisor to take timely intervention actions. But when the foreign supervisor decides whether to monitor the foreign unit or not, it doesn't take into consideration that foreign monitoring might affect the monitoring decision of the home supervisor. For example, if the foreign unit monitor, the home supervisor might only need to take a monitoring decision on the home unit when the information of the foreign monitoring is that the foreign unit has a bad assets. So this is something which we call the monitoring effect. So monitoring the foreign unit might allow the home supervisor to monitor the home unit only conditional on the monitoring outcome of the foreign unit. So what happens then when we move from national supervision where national supervisors take decision only with the aim of protecting depositors in their respective country to a single supranational framework? But in the single supranational framework, we now have one supervisor who's responsible for both units and minimizes the total expected losses for the deposit insurance in both units. Well, so we have these two effects, right? We have these two externalities. So one is the intervention externality and one is the monitoring externality. So in a framework when monitoring is necessary in order to take an intervention decision, actually when we move to supranational supervision, the supranational supervisor might increase foreign monitoring for the foreign unit when this monitoring effect is larger than the intervention effect. But things can go in the opposite way. So the supranational supervisor might decide to decrease monitoring when this intervention effect is large compared to the monitoring effect. When we look at the branch, given that there's only one supervisor, this is the home supervisor who takes care of depositors in both countries, here there is no externality because all the externalities, potential externalities, is going to be internalized by the home supervisor. What are the effects of this supervisory change for the bank in terms of profit and when it comes to organizational structure? So when supranational supervision increases foreign monitoring, so we have that this monitoring effect is particularly important compared to the intervention effect, then supranational supervision reducing the profitability of the subsidiary. So that's kind of a short-term effect. But in the long run or in the medium run, banks can adjust the foreign representation. So a bank can decide to turn a branch into a subsidiary or a subsidiary into a branch. So what could be then the long run effects of such supervisory change? So one effect could be, if before the bank was weakly supervising the host country, and that's why it chose to represent itself as a subsidiary, now that supranational supervision increases monitoring, the bank might have an incentive to turn itself into a branch. While the opposite is also possible, so if before the cross-border bank was operating a branch abroad because supervision in the host country was particularly tough, right? So this is the case when this intervention effect was very high, right, or large compared to the foreign monitoring effect. Then, when we have a change from national to supranational supervision, and now the supranational supervisor makes lower monitoring, then actually the branch might be turned into a subsidiary. So is it good or bad? Well, we have to look at this question from two viewpoints. So one is when we fix the organizational structure. So when we think about the short run, which is the bank cannot change its organizational structure, whenever we go from national to supranational supervision, supranational supervision is going to reduce the expected cost of deposit insurance in the two countries. So this is perfect, right? But if you think about the long run, what happens in the long run is that the bank is now going to adjust its structure in order to minimize the detrimental effect of going from national to supranational supervision, right? So for example, if, again, supranational supervision increases foreign monitoring, then the bank is going to turn the foreign unit into a branch. And if now supranational supervision reduces monitoring, then the bank has an incentive to turn a branch into a subsidiary, right? When the bank is turning a branch into a subsidiary, this might actually lead to higher expected deposit insurance costs than before when the bank was operating a branch. What happens in the opposite case? When the bank switches from subsidiary to a branch, well, this is kind of great news because the deposit insurance cost in the two countries is going to be reduced. But what happens in this case is that the distribution of deposit insurance costs is going to change. In particular, before the foreign unit was insured by the foreign deposit insurance and the home unit was insured by the home deposit insurance. Now what we have is that the home deposit insurance is going to reimburse depositors in both countries when the bank is going to fail, right? So what this means is that there will be quite a bit of weight now on the deposit insurance of the home country. Actually, there will be all the weight on the deposit insurance of the home country. Is it a problem? Well, we saw during the financial crisis one incident which is similar to this effect, right? So Icelandic banks, some Icelandic banks at least, established branches in the UK, right? When these Icelandic banks ran into trouble, then the Icelandic deposit insurance was in charge of reimbursing UK depositors. But Iceland had a large banking sector relative to its GDP. So the Icelandic deposit insurance scheme was not strong enough, was not well funded enough in order to be able to reimburse depositors, UK depositors, once these banks failed, right? So therefore, having branches when the country of origin for the bank has a weak deposit insurance actually can be of a problem. I was talking about how changes in supervisory architecture affect the decision whether to operate a branch or subsidiary abroad. Now we can also think about the decision to go abroad or to retreat domestically. So here I have an example. So for example, it might be possible that because supervision in the host country was weak, therefore a cross-border bank decided to establish a subsidiary now that we move from national to supranational supervision, and supranational supervision increases monitoring. This might lead to an exit decision by the foreign bank, right? So this is just to say that introduction of supranational supervision can also affect the decision to go abroad or to retreat domestically, so therefore also financial integration. In the previous framework, we kind of implicitly assumed that when we move from national to supranational supervision, the supranational supervisor has access to the same quality of information than national supervisor would. But we can take a small variation on this framework, and we can think about a framework in which, prior to moving to a supranational structure, local regulators collected information and they also acted upon this information. So now when we move from national to supranational supervision, it might still be the case that local supervisors collect information. Why? Because, for example, they might have an advantage in collecting or processing this information, but now we move the decision-making one level up. So the interesting question is how the separation of information collection from decision-making affect local supervisor incentive to collect information, and ultimately how this change then feedback to banks' incentive to take risk. So local supervisors might have slightly different objectives from supranational supervisors. So what does it mean? So for example, intervention costs might be just a little bit higher for a local supervisor when it makes a decision to intervene in a bank. Or maybe the cost of creating market turmoil because of intervention in the bank might be larger for the local supervisor, or might perceive to be larger than for a supranational supervisor. So why this is a problem? Well, this is a problem because if you have a system in which local supervisors collect information and the supranational supervisor is taking decisions, and the objective function of these two agencies are not perfectly aligned, then in a centralized supervisory system, local supervisor may collect less information than under national supervision. So what happens then? Well, then the impact of moving from national to supranational supervision on bank risk-taking is going to be ambiguous. Why? Well, for a given level of information, the central authority might be more likely to intervene because it has higher standard, because it has lower cost of intervention. But once we take into consideration that this information has to be collected in the first place, and it's going to be collected by local supervisor, they might collect less information, which might result in a system where, although we move from lower to higher supervisory standards by centralizing supervision, but overall risk-taking in the banking sector is going to be higher because less information is going to be collected under centralized supervision. So this is an interesting framework, and which might explain why, for example, in the European Union, the ECB and national supervisors do a joint supervision of the most significant systematically important banks in the EU. The last thing, the last issue I would like to talk about is the issue of ring fencing. We know that cross-border banks operate internal capital markets, and these internal capital markets actually can be a source of financial stability. So we have ample evidence that subsidiaries of strong foreign banks cut lending less than domestic banks during local banking crisis. We also know that cross-border banks can ease liquidity shortages in local banking crisis. So we often observe that healthy units have impaired units using resources from the healthy unit, which we call voluntary support. We also often read in the press that some of the support might have been stopped by the authority supervising the healthy unit with the incentives to protect local interests, so protect the local deposit insurance fund, right? So this is especially the case when we have banking units operating in different countries whose assets have a high correlation. Why, for example, because of economic integration, because of financial integration. So the first thing I would like to explain why when units have higher correlation, then ring fencing is more likely to emerge. If you think about the decision problem of the authority supervising the healthy unit, from a cost-benefit analysis, shifting resources from one unit to the other abroad has an obvious cost, right? So once the resources are shifted abroad, there are no resources available. These resources are not available in the healthy unit. But there is also benefit. The benefit is, for example, if the healthy unit makes an internal loan to an impaired unit, this loan might be repaid. And this is particularly important when in the future, maybe the healthy unit is now doing poorly and the once impaired unit recovers, right? Why? Because then this internal loan, when it's repaid, is going to reduce the cost of insuring depositors for the authority of the once healthy unit. So what happens when we move from national to supranational supervision? We often hear this argument that this is going to be a good thing because the supranational authority is going to eliminate or at least reduces ring fencing. Now, this is true in a framework when we have a supranational authority who cares about deposit insurance costs in both countries or in all the countries, right? Why? Because this authority is not going to take into consideration redistributional issues. Its only incentive, its only objective is to minimize losses for depositors in all the respective countries. But is removing ring fencing a good thing or not if we take into consideration also the bank's incentive to avoid ending up with units which have impaired assets? Well, the answer to this question is actually ambiguous. Why? Think about a framework when before we had ring fencing, so healthy units could not have the impaired unit, and now we remove ring fencing. There will be two effects, at least two effects, affecting the bank incentive to avoid ending up with distressed assets in its unit. So one effect is called the support giving effect, which is very similar to the charter value effect. When a unit takes decision how much effort to exert in order to avoid distress, it's going to take into consideration that when it is healthy, then he can have other units that experience financial distress. So when a unit takes decision about its effort, it knows that when there is higher effort, it's going to be more likely that the unit is going to be in a healthy state tomorrow, so it's more likely to be able to have other impaired units. But there is also a negative effect of removing ring fencing. And the negative effect is coming from an effect which we call support receiving effect. So before there was ring fencing, so if a unit was doing poorly, the local regulator might have intervened and the unit assets might have been liquidated. And so this was like a liquidation threat, which might have had a positive effect on exerting efforts to avoid financial distress. But now if there is no ring fencing going on, then a given unit is going to choose effort, taking into consideration when the unit is in distress, it can expect resources from other units which are doing well. So you see here there are two effects which come into play when we remove ring fencing. One is the support giving effect, which is boosting effort, and the support receiving effect, which is dampening effort incentives. So what is our final take then on this discussion whether ring fencing yes, ring fencing no? Well, if we move from national to supranational architecture, then ex post in resolution, so when a unit becomes impaired, the decisions might be more efficient, right? Why it might be more efficient? Because if we allow for resources to be channeled from healthy to impaired unit, maybe there will be less liquidation going on, so there will be more efficient decisions in resolution, so ex post. But the removal of ring fencing on the bank's ex ante effort is not at all clear. Why? Because of this support giving and support receiving effect playing in opposite direction. So both effects, or the relative magnitude of this effect, depends on how likely that from the point of view of a given unit, the other units are experiencing financial distress or are healthy. So the support giving effect is larger when the other units are kind of weak, so have weak fundamentals, because then it's more likely that they need resources in the future, and that's going to boost effort incentives in a given unit. The support receiving effect is large when the other units are doing well, because then they are more likely to be able to give support. So that that leads to the conclusion that the supranational supervisor only boosts higher effort ex ante, so higher efforts to avoid distress, when this is going to emerge for countries with weaker banks, with banks which have weaker fundamentals. Why? Because if you have a system, a banking system which starts out with weaker fundamentals, then the support giving effect is going to be large, the support receiving effect is going to be small. So then also this ex ante effect, incentive effect of supranational supervision is going to be positive. So to sum up, this lecture was intended to discuss some of the issues which arise with centralization of supervision, or in general with tighter cooperation among supervisors. I was arguing that centralization of supervision might offer efficiency benefits, but in order to assess its long-run effects, one needs to understand how national supervisors react to the new system, for example, in their information collection actions. And I was also arguing that we have to look at the bank's long-run reaction to the new architectures. Because once we take this into consideration, actually, we can see that the impact of moving from national to centralized supervision might be lower than we initially thought. Thank you very much for listening to this lecture.